I'm Greg DePalma, and you're listening to Prime Sports Hockey with Jan Levine on the Prime Sports Radio Network. And on today's show, we're going to recap the top deadline deals from yesterday, including the huge Ryan McDonagh to Tampa Bay deal, Evander Kane to San Jose, Paul Stastny to Winnipeg, and more, as Prime Sports Hockey on the Prime Sports Radio Network starts now. All right, it's Tuesday, the 27th of February, 2018. Thanks again for tuning in to Prime Sports Hockey with PSN hockey editor and RotoWire.com writer with his barometer reports, Jan Levine. You can follow him on Twitter at AirJan23. So, Jan, Ranger fan, what did you think about the McDonagh deal from a Rangers perspective?
Greg, first, good to talk to you again. Obviously, it's been a little bit of a crazy week in terms of deadline deals in the NHL as a whole. I mean, with the Rangers, the letter came out a couple of weeks ago, which I think we discussed, that they said the cut might be deep, maybe not necessarily using those words, but pretty much said that, that you could see some familiar faces going. And a lot of us kind of figured that Ryan McDonagh could be one. Matt Zuccarello might be the other. There were a lot of other names potentially in the mix that could go. And as we saw from the deadline deals leading up to the past week, there were definitely some familiar names that went. The unrestricted free agents like Rick Nash, Michael Grabner, and Nick Holden, all were not surprises to be dealt given where New York is. The big question was, would Ryan McDonagh be dealt before the deadline, or would they wait to the draft and then deal him then? And a deal came down reportedly literally with about a minute to go on the clock, right before the 3 p.m. Eastern deadline, dealing Ryan McDonagh and JT Miller to Tampa for a package headed by Nemesnikov, who's the one player they got in terms of a roster player, but then other prospects, and also a 2018 first round pick and a conditional second round pick in 2019 that becomes a first rounder if Tampa wins the Stanley Cup either this year or next year. So a couple of things. So Nemesnikov is a guy who can drive possession. Good creator. I mean, the big question is, and we talked a little about him, I think, earlier this year, is he a product of having skated with Steven Stamkos and Nikita Kucherov?
Sure.
Or is he the kind of guy that was basically taking that next step forward in his third year? And a lot of people are of the belief that he was taking another step forward this year, partly sheltered by the offensive zone starts that he had, as opposed to, Nash and others, and even Miller, who stored a lot of their possessions in the defensive zone and moved forward. So from what it looks like, the Miller-Nemesnikov swap was kind of more of a one-for-one. A lot of rumors coming out that New York was looking to deal Miller. I actually went to the Jean Ratelle ceremony on Sunday. Very interesting that Miller scored one of the 2 Ranger goals with an absolute howitzer, top shelf over Jimmy Howard's shoulder for the goal. And I happen to like Miller a lot. Granted, he had a lot of defensive zone deficiencies, which is one of those things that Coach Alain Vigneault was trying to get out of his game, and it kind of done a lot of tough love associated with that to try to get him to be much better defensively, to not take stupid penalties, to be more aware on the ice. And I thought that he, Kevin Hayes, and Ryan Spooner, who came over in the Rick Nash deal, would have been a nice third line, where Spooner and Hayes are much more pass first. Miller, while he can be pass first, is more of a shoot first option. But with the swap of Miller for Nemesnikov, the Rangers get a guy who's a little bit more of a player who looks for a shot as opposed to as a creator. And then the McDonagh part of the deal, once McDonagh was not at the Ratelle ceremony, which surprised me a lot as the captain, he wasn't there. Then when you add in all of the conversation and chatter over the past several weeks where it pretty much looked like McDonagh was going to go, it was only a question of when. Him getting traded did not come as a big surprise, and Tampa was one of the more prominent teams mentioned. The one piece that was surprising was the prospects they got. I mean, Brett Howden's a big kid who's likely going to grow a little bit. The question is the upside for him. Looks to be maybe a second or third line center. Hajek, who's the other player they got, a 20-year-old who played with Filip Heikel on the Czech team in the World Juniors this year, is a defenseman who projects maybe to be a top 4, probably a second pairing defenseman, not an elite guy. There was a lot of other players the Rangers could have gotten. Cal Foote on the blue line was one. Mikhail Sergachev was one who's in Tampa this year, who came over. The Jonathan Gruden trade was the other one a lot of us wanted. I particularly wanted Braden Point, so we all knew as Ranger fans that was kind of a pipe dream. Taylor Radish is another player that the Rangers could have gone for. So there's questions as to the level of prospects they got back, but what they have done with all these trades is they've boosted and bolstered the farm system, which is something that's been lacking because of all the trades the Rangers made while they were contending the last several years. So getting the picks in pretty much all their trades, getting the pick for Grabner and the defenseman Rykov, getting the first rounder for Nash along with Spooner in that trade, getting the pick for Nick Holden. Now the Rangers have 7 picks in the first 3 rounds, 3 in the first round, their own, Boston's and Tampa's. And now the question is A, how far does New York slide in the standings? And B, where do they end up when the ping pong balls come out and they make that selection? If it's one of the top 4, then what they've done is put themselves in a position to get themselves one of the elite players in the draft this year. If they slide down a little bit, they may end up using those other picks, the Boston and the Tampa pick, to try to move up, to try to nail one of those elite players in the draft this season.
Well, the Nash deal, what do you think about that? I thought that was a good deal. Nash hadn't, especially when you're rebuilding, it's a no-brainer. But for what you were able to get from Boston, weren't you satisfied with what the Rangers were able to get from him?
Yes, absolutely. There were rumors that they wanted a first, another player, and a prospect. They got the first back, which was great. They got Spooner back, which is a guy who's going to be a restricted free agent. So the question becomes is how much is he going to get paid this year, or do the Rangers look to flip him? There were some questions as to whether New York would try to flip him yesterday. He did have 2 assists on Sunday at the game, looked pretty good in the small sample size. I saw a player that I happen to like a lot. I think he was underutilized in Boston at times, and production-wise was fairly even or close to it in terms of Nash. So I think you put him and Hayes on the same line potentially. And granted, Rangers still have a whole lot of questions with a lot of restricted free agents, Hayes being another one, in terms of what they're going to do. And Miller, who they dealt with, going to be another restricted free agent. Same with Jimmy Vesey, same with Brady Shea. So Jeff Gorton's work has not ended by any stretch of the imagination, because if they're going to go for the rebuild, does that include trading Zuccarello, who's got 1 year left on his current deal? Does that include trading Kreider, who I believe has got 2 years left on his deal? So while GM Jeff Gorton has done the initial foray and made lots of changes, the work is clearly not done. I think a lot of it's going to depend on where they land in the draft this year. Do they look to bring back both Nash and Grabner? Are they looking to contend in 2019, or is that viewed as another rebuilding year with projecting forward to 2020, which I believe also it may be the last season that Henrik Lundqvist is under contract as well.
And what about any of the remaining elder statesmen on the team, including Lundqvist? Do you believe they're going to be around the next couple of years? Let's just start even with next year. Do you think any of the remaining veterans that are on this team will be here next year?
I don't know if there'll be massive changes. It wouldn't shock me. So Mika Zibanejad has several more years left, but I think New York still views him as a top 1 or 2 center. Chris Kreider's got 2 more years left, and if Kreider plays like he did when I saw him on Sunday, I think they're going to retain him. Zuccarello is got 1 more year left. I could see him getting dealt, but as of right now, he may end up the captain actually on this team, given in terms of the emotional leadership he provides them. Shattenkirk's got several years left. I don't think there's going to be a material market for him given the injury he's coming off of. Mark Stahl, until his recent injuries, was probably the most consistent blue liner, but he's also got 3 years left at $5.7 million. There was rumors that he could be a buyout candidate. If he's not going to be one, then Brendan Smith, who had a horrific year in the first year of a 4-year contract that he signed, is most certainly a candidate. But getting to Lundqvist, he's making $8.5 million for the next 3 seasons after this one. So we go through 2021. A, finding somebody to take on that amount. B, even if they eat half of that contract, getting a reasonable return for him may be difficult. There are teams that probably could take them on, and if the Rangers were going to do a full-blown, complete and utter teardown and rebuild, I could see them maybe going that route. But Lundqvist has indicated that he wants to be here for the remainder of his deal. He wants to stay through the rebuild. And, as we've seen in the NHL, just because you've torn down in 1 year doesn't mean you can't bolster yourself back up next year. So
sure.
For instance, let's say New York does bring back Grabner and Nash. I'm not saying that they will, but let's say they do. Let's say, for example, they do get a top 4 pick and grab one of the big forwards, either Philippe Zadina or Brady Tkachuk, one of those guys who's ready in a year or so. And the guys like Elias Anderson and Filipito come up and provide what they can provide, and you have Zibanejad and Mensnikov and Hayes, you get a rebuild out of Shattenkirk after the poor year he had, and some of the young defensemen they have kind of take that next step forward, and they augment in either free agency with some other players. Then all of a sudden you could be looking like at mid-year or towards the trade deadline as more of an acquirer than a seller again. Granted, a lot of ifs, a lot of things still to be played out. So the future direction, at least in terms of next year, isn't clear. I think the goal is most certainly to try to contend in 2019-20, whilst next year potentially viewed as another rebuilding kind of a season. So that's going to kind of depend on who returns to this team and what they do in the draft, and also obviously in free agency.
What was there? Because it doesn't appear to me that there were any major drastic roster changes since their Stanley Cup run a couple of years ago. So what happened?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, in terms of changes, there's kind of constant change in this organization.
Sure.
It may not look it on paper, but I mean, if you look back, when they made the run that year, they traded their captain Ryan Callahan, right, to go ahead and go get Martin St. Louis. Even before that, they traded Dubinsky and Anisimov to get Rick Nash. Then they traded Gabrick to get Derek Brassard. And as I said, Callahan went and they brought back Martin St. Louis for attempted run to the Cup run. Even after they made that run to the Cup, that following year they got Yandel and tried to make another run and lost in the Eastern Conference Finals. And they turned over Hagelin and Talbot. Then they turned around and they traded Brassard and got back to Zibanejad. And then last year they went out and got Brendan Smith. So every year there's definitely been change.
So the changes weren't working then. A lot of these deals that they made just were most of them.
Well, look, they lost in the conference. They lost in the Stanley Cup Finals to LA. 3 of the games going into overtime, 2 of them going into double overtime. And while LA was the better team, New York was clearly in that series and had a shot at winning it. Then the following year, they made it to the Eastern Conference Finals.
Yep.
Despite losing Matt Zuccarello, which was a huge loss, because if you look at the games they lost to Tampa at home, they got shut out in most of them. Game 7 at home was a 0-0 game going to the third period. 1 goal, and despite all the injuries, you're in the Stanley Cup Finals for the second year in a row.
Sure.
The following year, they got blitzed by a Pittsburgh team that was a dominant team and obviously won the Cup. And then last year, we talked about during the playoffs, Coach Alain Vigneault and his deployment issues is still a problem. Used the wrong defenseman in games 2 and 5 down the stretch against Ottawa, losing 2 games that New York probably should have won. And if they win those games, which in my opinion they should have, now all of a sudden you're playing Pittsburgh once again in the Eastern Conference Finals.
Yeah. So what do you think, though? I mean, do you think that
this year I think they got old.
Okay.
There was a lot of injuries.
Okay.
The defense was horrific in front of Lundqvist. Brendan Smith was horrible after being a stalwart where he came over last year. Kevin Shattenkirk played injured and regressed. Losing Girardi was supposed to help this team, but it ended up not helping them in terms of the defensive style. Nick Holden got put up to be a top pairing defenseman because Smith was so poor and Shattenkirk wasn't a good mesh with McDonough, and that hurt them. McDonough got hurt and suffered through a poor year. And then offensively, you lost Kreider, you lost other forwards in terms of to injury. Then you add all that up together, and that's the perfect mixture for a collapse during the season. Pretty poor start, 3-7-2. I believe they went 13-6-1 over the next 20 or so to get themselves back in contention, and basically had gotten themselves into third, almost a second in the division. And then all of a sudden the bottom fell out again, where their poor defensive play created massive open opportunities, especially in high danger zones, that Lundqvist wasn't able to bail them out, and that's what caused a lot of the losses recently.
And most of the fans agree with this thinking that it is time to rebuild, and instead of going whatever other path that you might have been able to go to try to one more time at this deadline or before the deadline to try to see if you can do something. Because as we've seen many times in the NHL, you don't have to be a top seed to win the championship. You can go in as a 7 or 6 seed and win a cup. So, but were most of the fans all in, or were most of them in for the rebuild?
I would say that early on there was a handful. And as time wore on and we saw the warts on the team and realized that they weren't getting any better anytime soon and that we were fooling ourselves to expect another run, more and more people came on board. And then I finally probably came on board probably within the last 2 to 3 weeks or so, realizing that this team just doesn't have the horses to go forward, and that a tear down in the rebuild, especially given Grabner and Nash being unrestricted free agents, was the right direction to go to try to bolster the prospects, to try to bolster the farm, bring in young talent, move in a new direction. Now granted, your prospect evaluators sure as heck better have been right in terms of the guys you've gotten back on a lot of these deals, because if not, in terms of taking, especially in Tampa, taking some prospects over others, and part of that may have been dependent on who was available. And now clearly you need to get lucky in the draft in terms of where you end up in terms of the upper portion of the draft. But then more important, the pressure now is on Gord Clark, who's the player development director and the person who kind of runs a lot of the draft to get it right when it comes to the picks that he made. I mean, there's a lot of questions last year taking Elias Anderson over a kid like Casey Middlestat and some of the other guys. You know, Philip Hito was taken over Klim Kostin, Eloy Tolvanen, who's a kid from Nashville, who's going to make a big difference down the stretch. So there's definitely a lot of pressure on Gord Clark to hit a home run in this year's draft.
All right. And by the way, Vigneault, do you think he'll be back next year?
It's a great question. Jeff Gordon in his press conference yesterday really didn't give a good answer, and he hasn't given a good answer to date. I go back and forth. I still think he's a good coach. I just don't know whether he's the right coach for a young team. So if the team is to go for another rebuild next year and to build with youth, I don't know whether or not his viewpoint of reliance on veterans or the love he shows veterans may be the direction to go.
Yeah. Being a former Vancouver coach, I don't think he would be the right guy for a rebuild, because you're right. He relies way too much on veteran players. Look, the fact is, what you could do is just make sure he doesn't have enough veteran players for him to rely on, and he has no alternative to play kids. But anyway, I mean, there's nobody in the system as far as a coach that is waiting in the wings. If they were to get rid of Vigneault, would they have to go outside the organization?
I personally think they would. I mean, again, the one guy I've been thinking of, and granted, a lot of names haven't come back yet, but the kid guy Travis Green would be a nice choice in my opinion.
Yeah, well, he ain't going anywhere.
I know you know a lot about him, so.
Yeah, well, he ain't going nowhere. All right, so Tampa Bay, their perspective, we both, when we talked last time, felt pretty confident that, especially after last year, how much that we still thought that they could have made a run. Of course, the Stamkos injury, even though that happened, we understood still how talented the team was, but it just never worked out last year. So this year, not surprising that they're back to being maybe the team to beat. Did they do enough? Because let's keep in mind, they have a boatload of prospects, as you mentioned. They have so many other young players that they could have dealt. But do you think they need to or needed to? Do you think they've done everything that was required? That there's no more room, that they have filled every possible weakness on the team, and now they're ready to win a Stanley Cup?
I think they clearly improved their team from where they were. So they got themselves a top 4 defenseman in the minimum in McDonough, who, if he's healthy, provides them another solid blue liner. And while I like Sergachev, he's young. In the playoffs, you want to have a player who's got some experience, and clearly McDonough's got that. Then you also added a kid in JT Miller, who's a bit more of a gritty two-way player than Nemesnikov, who's a bit more of a one-way type of option. And you can put Miller either on the second line or the third line. So, I mean, Tampa was pretty darn good beforehand. And now when you add in the 2 pieces that they added, and the only piece they really took away was Nemesnikov, who got replaced by Miller, you would kind of think that they most certainly have the horses to make a run. And granted, it's not going to be easy, because you're potentially looking at a second-round matchup against Boston, and then potentially a championship matchup right now against Pittsburgh, because I think a lot of us still believe that Pittsburgh is most certainly probably the favorite still to come out of the East.
Say that again?
I think Pittsburgh is still the favorite to come out of the East.
You still think Pittsburgh is the Eastern over Tampa Bay? What, really? Okay. So you just think it's just a matter of...
Look, you have to slay the beast to be able to get past them. Pittsburgh just added a pretty darn good third-line center in Derek Brassard, who can play on the power play, either the first or second pairing. If you have an injury, can slide up from your third to your second pair. He adds a nice little element that's been lacking with Nick Menino being gone there. Pittsburgh, made some nice moves also at the deadline. They got rid of Ian Cole, so maybe that's an impact because he's been a pretty good player for them in the playoffs. The hope is that Matt Hunwick can step up as maybe your 6th defenseman, so I'd say that's a downgrade. when you add in Broussard as your third line center, and especially when you couple it with how good Evgeny Malkin has been this year, especially recently, it's kind of hard to rule against them. But granted, as long as they don't suffer any material injuries between the pipes, because they really don't have a good backup behind Matt Murray.
And how's he playing, by the way? How's he playing after? I mean, he struggled earlier this season.
Murray's played very well. I think Pittsburgh was 15-4-1 in their last 20 until recently.
Okay.
Leading up, I think, to when they got Broussard. So they've been on fire. Ironically enough, though, Philly is the team that leads the Metro Division right now on the hot streak that they're on right now. But I don't know if any of us believe that Peter Mrazek is the answer come playoff time for them. So to me, as I said, you have to slay the beast to get past them. And right now, I'm not sure if anyone's going to take down Pittsburgh. Now, the wear and tear may catch up to them over having 2 long playoff runs and then potentially a third one this year. But right now, to me, I still think you have to view Pittsburgh as like 1A and Tampa Bay as 1B coming out of the East.
All right. What about in the East? Speaking of Columbus, we know that there was a lot of hope last season, and they ran into Pittsburgh, but that's going to happen. Of course, the goaltending situation was a big issue, but they acquired Vanek, Cole, and Letestu. So do you think that's enough where they might be able to surprise some people in the East?
I think Vanek definitely helps. It gives them another option as a scorer. He's a rental, didn't cost them a ton. Letestu gives them a guy who's been in Columbus before, gives them a fourth-line player. Cole gives them another solid blue liner, a guy who clearly had playoff experience. But I think with Columbus, it all ends and begins between the pipes.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, if Bobrovsky had a big series, they probably would have beaten Pittsburgh, and he was horrific. If Bobrovsky doesn't play like he did during the regular season in the playoffs, and part of that, granted, is the matchups and everything else, then they're going to be in a whole heap of trouble, because right now they're going to have to play Tampa in the first round, and I don't know if they beat Tampa. It kind of depends on where they end up in the seedings. Do they get the first or the second wild card? Does who comes out of the Eaton Metro? Is it Philly? Is it Washington? Is it Pittsburgh? If it's Philly, who's the 1 seed, and then the number 2 overall seed, and Columbus as a 7 seed, I wouldn't have a problem taking Columbus over Philly. But if they get matched up against, let's say, Pittsburgh, I think they're going to have a much more difficult time coming out of the East, coming out of that bracket, same as if they have to go against Tampa in the first round.
Did you like the deals themselves that they made? Do you think?
Yeah, I like the deals. I mean, they bolstered the depth. They didn't give up an inordinate amount to get these guys. I mean, Vanek giving up Mott is nothing tremendous, and UC Jokinen. For Cole, they didn't give up a ton, and same with Letestu. So they didn't impact their prospects they have in the system, or taking away a lot of the youth within the system that they couldn't move. So overall, I think they did a pretty good job in terms of potentially improving their team. And it all depends right now. I mean, the team that I thought might go out and get a player or two at the deadline was Florida. Now that Luongo is back, to a certain extent, I think they're galvanized by the unfortunate incident, obviously the shooting in Parkland, where Luongo has lived for 12 years, made a tremendous impassioned speech, the first game back after the tragedy when Florida's at home. They have 4 games in hand on Columbus. They're 7 points behind them for the second wild card spot. And that was a team where I really thought might take a run out of getting players. But you have to like what New Jersey did, getting Grabner, giving up the second rounder, and also giving up the prospect Rykov, who they definitely could move, and then also getting Patrick Maroon, for not a huge return, and Maroon's kind of a big physical winger. So they've added 2 top 9 wingers to go along with what they have in their system, with Taylor Hall, who's been on a run, and Hischier and Bratt and players like that. And you look at when Corey Schneider's coming back in a couple of more days, New Jersey looked to really solidify themselves as a potential one of the 2 wild card teams to come out of the East, especially coming out of the Metro.
All right. What about Boston? And because we talked a little bit about the Nash deal. They also bring in Wingels and Holden. Do you think that they are for real? I mean, are they this good? Or are they a team that you think can go far?
I mean, I think, first of all, it all depends on how well Tuukka Rask plays, and I don't think we've seen anything that indicates that Rask can't do the job come playoff time. I mean, Holden is a depth defenseman, probably a 7th, 8th defenseman, but could stand in if you need him to be your 6th defenseman come playoff time. Nash is definitely going to play on the second line there. Probably gives him an upgrade in terms of their second line winger to go along with with the guys that are there right now with Krejci and DeBrusk, a pretty good second line. I mean, the bigger impact is today it was announced that Patrice Bergeron will miss at least 2 weeks with a fractured right foot. And again, given it's a fracture, he might miss a lot more than 2 weeks. So them getting Nash, even though it was for Spooner, that swap still probably bodes well for them in terms of the upgrade and the talent. It all depends on, what happens to that top line with Pastrnak and Marchand. Now that Bergeron, who is tremendous defensively, Selke Award winner, also contributes offensively more than people expect. Boston's still in a pretty good shape in terms of getting the 3 seed coming out of that division. I mean, they have 60 games, they have 82 points, they have 5 games in hand on Toronto, who's only 2 points ahead of them. They have 3 games in hand on Tampa, who's 7 points ahead of them. I mean, if you look into the division, they have 18 points. They have, in terms of division over Florida, they're 20 points ahead with Florida with a game in hand. So I would kind of say, unless something goes tremendously haywire and untoward, they're pretty locked into one of the 3 seeds. The only thing that could impact them is seeding, because without a full complement of players, them moving up to pass Toronto, which with 5 games in hand and 2 games back looks fairly likely, especially with Toronto missing Austin Matthews with a shoulder injury for at least the next week or 2, if not longer. But the likelihood of them even getting past Tampa, with Tampa now having the acquisitions of McDonough, who'll be back in about a week or so, and also with JT Miller, even though Boston had a couple of games in hand, looks a little less likely. So Boston is probably locked in to a first-round matchup against Toronto.
Do you think Boston's the best defensive team in hockey? And if not,
I think what I've seen so far is I don't know about if they're not the best of one of them. I mean, you look at McAvoy, who's really settled in beautifully on that team. You look what Torrey Krug can do there. To me, the biggest thing, in my opinion, has been the play of Zdeno Chara this year, who's had a rebirth and a resurgence. Brandon Carlo has been very good as a forward defenseman, the guy who I wanted the Rangers to get in a lot of the trades, with them wasn't necessarily the prospect in terms of Lindgren. Was Carlo would have been a decent option, especially if I knew he was coming back with Spooner in the 1. But if you look at the top 4 of Chara, McAvoy, Krug, Carlo, you have 2 puck-moving guys in McAvoy and Krug. You have 2 defensive defensemen in Chara and Carlo. Pretty darn good top 4 with Miller or McQuaid as your 5th defenseman and Holden potentially as your 6th, and then having Rask and Hudobin between the pipes is a pretty darn good backline.
All right. What about Ottawa? They did not make the Erik Karlsson move. They've made enough moves though to start their own rebuild. You think Erik Karlsson is going to be on Ottawa next year?
No. I mean, well, let me kind of rephrase that. Supposedly the rumor is that Vegas may have offered 6 pieces for Karlsson.
Okay.
And they were turned down. So
really?
That lends me to believe that Ottawa will only move Karlsson as if they're completely blown away. Now, I'm not quite sure how much more you could get than 6 pieces in a trade. And granted, I don't necessarily know what those names are.
Sure.
I'll do a little research and trying to find out if we can find out what those names are. But I would say there is a better than strong likelihood that Karlsson does get moved. I mean, he's got 1 more year left, right? So if you think about it, he and McDonough were the 2 guys in similar statuses. McDonough making about $1.8 million less per year right now than Karlsson does. Karlsson obviously having had that ankle issue where part of the ankle had to be shaved down. So it didn't really materially impact him last year as he led Ottawa to the Eastern Conference Finals where they lost to Pittsburgh in Game 7. But with Ottawa, probably in even more of a full rebuild, and them trying to attach Bobby Ryan's $7.2 million AAV for the next 4 seasons after this one to any deal, they're not going to have a lot of suitors because not everybody can take on that kind of a cap hit unless Ottawa eats a part of the salary. So that, Vegas clearly was the team that had the cap room to make a deal, clearly was willing to give up the prospects because of the expansion draft last year and all the picks they got and the prospects they acquired. I just don't know whether or not Ottawa is going to find a suitor that's well worth taking Karlsson, but I wouldn't be shocked if Karlsson is dealt sometime at the draft or at a minimum at the trade deadline last year, especially if Ottawa's struggling again, which seems likely.
Why? How? I don't know. What exactly happened to this team fell apart so much? As you mentioned, they were that close from the final. They were that close from knocking Pittsburgh out maybe no team was closer to beating Pittsburgh the last two years in the postseason, and then it just fell up. What happened?
I think the locker room, especially the relationship with the GM, Dorian, clearly was one that was adversarial at best, and that's probably putting it nicely. I think there's a lot of stuff that went on behind the scenes that started to filter out, and a lot of issues in terms of what transpired within the locker room with the GM that didn't help matters.
Okay.
You look at Craig Anderson kind of stood on his head, partially motivated by the return to action, with his wife dealing with the unfortunate cancer diagnosis, and that was a galvanizing point.
Yeah.
You had the perfect storm where, as we said the Rangers should have beaten that team in 5 games last year.
Yeah, sure.
They were a team that JC was playing with magic and playing for a higher cause and made a ton of late comebacks to get themselves to that position. Carlson was otherworldly last year, and maybe he's taken a step back in the ankle injury. Hoffman's had a good year. Mike Hoffman's had a good year. And Mark Stone's had a good year. Derek Brassard did not have a good first third of the season, but started to pick it up. Bobby Ryan's had a pretty lousy season overall in terms of his production not being there, so that's clearly impacted them. The blue line, other than Carlson, has been nothing special. Thomas Chabot looks like he'll be a nice piece, but hasn't been great. And they imported in Marian Gaborik recently. I don't know how much that's going to be. And then the big issue is they gave up an enormous amount to get Matt Duchene. Duchene got off to a pretty lousy start, and that was rebounded last 20 or so games, but that slow start created material issues because they got so far behind they weren't able to catch up. But I do think is the ownership issue with Eugene Melnyk and the issues with Ottawa with Melnyk as the owner in general and associated with the arena and everything associated with that. And then you couple in the relationship in the locker room with the GM, and you have a recipe for disaster, which is what's happened there.
All right, let's go to the West. And San Jose made the big deal in the West. They bring in Kane from Buffalo. This has been a rumor for over a year now, so Kane finally goes. Do you think he's the right guy? Talent-wise, he's there, but do you think he's the right guy in the locker room, in playoff games, which he's never participated in, that you can believe that that's going to do something and impact San Jose in the postseason?
I think, to me, he falls into the head of $1 million arm, 10-cent head a lot of times, based upon the view of him, right? But if you look at the strong leadership within that room, you have Joe Thornton, who's coming back, and from his injury, is supposed to be back by the end of the season. And that's a guy who's a very strong leader, so he could potentially provide the right kind of leadership associated with for Kane. Logan Couture is the same type. Joe Pavelski is the same type. Brett Burns is the same type. So there's a lot of strong leadership within that locker room, and even Peter DeBoer is the coach. So he's stepping into a situation where you hope that those guys who've been in the system for a while, and a lot of them are not aged except for Thornton, but older veterans, could provide the right kind of leadership for Kane stepping in there. And he obviously wants to put his best foot forward because that'll drive the type of next contract that he gets. So he's clearly going to be playing for a new contract there. He probably lost interest in Buffalo with all the issues there and the struggles after his strong start. But when you look at the guys that are in the room, and also Martin Jones has played much better. Brent Burns, who's shifted between forward and defense, has picked up his game in the last 20 or so games or so. So while I don't think San Jose is as strong as they were in years past, they're clearly not a team to overlook come playoff time given their pedigree.
All right, and what about Nashville? This deal with Chicago is kind of strange because you figured Hartman was one of these young players that would be a part of Chicago getting younger and kind of rebuilding, but then they traded him away to Nashville. This should be a good deal for Nashville, shouldn't it?
Yeah, they gave up a lot though, giving up a first rounder, though the expectation is it'll be towards the back end of the first round. But they view Hartman as a young enough winger who's going to be an RFA after the year. When you factor in them adding Mike Fisher for a 1-year deal, and he might be your third or fourth line center, and coming back fresh because he hasn't played all season. Then Eli Toivonen, who was great in the World Juniors, but especially we saw what kind of performance he had in the Olympics, and he's expected to be in the future an elite winger. You've now added three potentially top 9 forwards to the mix to lengthen and add to the depth of your lineup, and making Nashville, when you look at the blue line with Subban and Yossi and Ekholm and Ryan Ellis, who's a little banged up now. But when you look at the blue line, what we saw last year, and then Pekka Rinne, who's been phenomenal between the pipes again, Nashville has to move towards the top as a contender to come out of the West again.
Yeah, and the other team, along with Boston, that is definitely one of the top, if not the top, defensive team in hockey. And that a big reason is Rennie's play. What about Winnipeg? Winnipeg probably surprised a lot of people, and maybe some people were surprised that Stastny, who had a no-trade clause, that said, okay, I'll go to Winnipeg. So that's nice to see.
Yeah, I mean, the rumor is that Blake Wheeler, who's been friendly with Stastny for years, was on the phone with Stastny on Sunday night when rumors of the deal started coming out, not externally, but obviously within the organization. He convinced Stastny to come. You look at Stastny as a number 2 or number 3 center behind Mark Scheifele, who's one of those guys that not a lot of the league knows about unless you follow it closely, but
Sure.
He's definitely a top line center. You look at what Winnipeg has done this year in the depth, and then they're only going to get stronger when Jacob Trouba comes back from his ankle injury. To me, they're a team that others might have been sleeping on, but if Connor Hellebuck continues to play as he has now, and you look at the firepower with Scheifele and Blake Wheeler and Matthew Perreault has been great, and Paul Stastny and Patrick Laine and Kyle Connor and Nikolai Ehlers, that's a pretty darn good top 6, top 9 right now, maybe one of the best in the league. And you couple that with the resurgence from Tyler Myers and Dustin Buckland having a good season. And then once eventually you get Jacob Trouba back to go with the growth that Josh Morrissey has shown this year, if Hellebuck can be the guy between the pipes, Winnipeg is going to be an awfully tough out, especially as we've seen they have a material home ice advantage that's only going to get more material once the playoffs start. And that place goes crazy because they haven't made the playoffs in a while.
Yeah, the only thing is a lot of guys that haven't experienced the playoffs before, especially any sort of long playoff run. But if if they're at a long shot or considered a long shot, I'm not talking big number because that's not going to happen. Then that's something. But I don't know if I would peg them as one of the favorites because they just don't have enough experience to win a cup. But then again, the talent's there, and we'll just see whether they can put it all together. We'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. Finally, Anaheim, LA, Calgary, Dallas, Minnesota, St. Louis. These are all teams in contention that didn't do anything, really, right? Any particular reason why?
I mean, Anaheim views that if they're healthy enough in their trade for Adam Henrique, probably, put them over the top. Jason Chimera could be one of those fourth line guys, one of those grit guys for the playoffs. I mean, that may be one of the reasons why they didn't do much. St. Louis, I think, is in sell mode. That rough patch that they've gone through now, especially Jake Allen between the pipes.
Yeah.
The questions, with him again, whether or not he's the answer. He's one of those guys that that basically they've completely gone in the wrong direction by far. So I think that's a reason why they didn't make a move. If you would ask me a month ago, they would have been on the acquiring side of the equation. They were rumored to be interested in some of the guys from the Rangers. But now they clearly are going in the complete opposite direction right now, in terms of what they're doing. You look at, you said some of those teams who didn't make moves, and it does come, I think, as a bit of a surprise in terms of not acquiring it, but some of those teams may already view themselves as kind of not in contention right now. And therefore there's no point in throwing quote unquote good money after bad to bring in guys. I would have thought maybe Minnesota would have done something, but they may be happy where they are. Vegas, Vegas has been the surprise story. As I said, they were clearly in on Carlson. They basically offered a ton of guys for Carlson, and I gotta be honest with you, if they had gotten Carlson with what exists on that team, that would have been a very interesting team to try to play come playoff time, because but the one move they didn't make, and they gave up an absolute ton, a first next year and I think a second year after, the third year after that. So they have a lot of fixes to get Tomas Tatar, and Tatar is a guy who struggled in terms of consistency, but he is a guy who's been a quote unquote fairly consistent 20-goal scorer, and you add another guy to the mix, and they're going to be a difficult team in terms of as an out. To come out. Dallas didn't do a ton. I really thought Dallas might make a move, and it did, surprise me a wee bit that Dallas didn't do anything. But they may view themselves as, look, the roster they have, they're pretty happy with the guys that they have. They didn't want to basically, quote unquote, screw up the mix by adding guys. I really thought they might add a depth piece. So I am a little surprised that Dallas didn't go ahead and try to maybe add something just to get thrown into the mix to kind of maybe, I wouldn't say shake things up, but extend the lineup a little bit. LA is the same way. I think LA had been, rumored to be making some deals, but nothing ended up coming to fruition. I mean, again, I think LA has been a bit of a surprise this year.
Yeah.
I am a little surprised it didn't go out and try to make more moves. I mean, they did their one move last week by getting Tobias Reeder. Once they did that, and they gave up Darcy Kemper, who, in my opinion, was a really great backup to Jonathan Quick. So there's a lot of pressure on Quick right now. So they made their moves. They made their move about a little over a week ago. Reeder. Once they got Reeder, that took him out of the Michael Grabner sweepstakes, because Reeder is kind of a guy who's very similar to Grabner. They viewed themselves as getting themselves their third line winger right there, and therefore they didn't necessarily need to go forward. In Calgary, went out and got Nick Shore, very kind of a small deal, not a impact kind of a deal. They've been better than expected, and obviously their ability to either make the playoffs or even make a run in the playoffs. There's about 5 teams mixed up there. I mean, Colorado wasn't going to go forward. They've already made their big deals when they traded Duchesne, and the picks that they got back there. And now that they're fully healthy with McKinnon back, they've got an outside shot. So right now they're playing with house money, and they probably view it as, look, we are on the bridge of maybe making the playoffs, but we don't view ourselves as a true contender this year. Why don't we worry about, staying with what we got this year, using the pick that we got in the Duchesne deal, and try to improve our team moving forward. We signed Alex Kerfoot last year. He's a guy that basically was kind of a free addition at the time. Tyson Jost has now played a little bit better. They got Barry back, who was hurt. They lost Eric Johnson, but their viewpoint is that, look, we aren't going to view ourselves as real contenders this year.
Nor should
but
they.
But maybe in another year, when you augment the roster using the picks that they got or in free agency, maybe they will be then.
Before I let you go, I must say, and I understand the entire reason why, as far as the Olympics and the location, why we got what we got for hockey in the Olympics. But I got to tell you, there's just no doubt it was clearly the worst Olympics for hockey that I have ever seen. And I didn't even watch much of it. It's a disaster. And I don't know, there's nothing you could do about it. I mean, again, logistics is what it is. I mean, was there anything that could have been done that wasn't done in order to make sure that this doesn't sure this doesn't happen again? Because this is terrible.
The problem is going to be is 2022 in Beijing going to be any better? Is the timetable or time frame any different?
Maybe
the
not.
Only difference there is that the NHL supposedly is already going to be going to China anyway, and maybe that serves as a driver to push them. I just didn't think they wanted to go Pyeongchang, but Beijing, especially with the entreaties they've already made there, and some of the movement they've made to kind of establish a quote unquote foothold there.
Okay.
That could drive 2022. And again, part of it may be driven by what happens with the CBA and the conversations that happen there, because I think the next CBA is up before the Olympics, and I think there's a lot of players who clearly wanted to go. And I think that what we saw is that the amateurs are nice, but once you've gone to the professionals, it's kind of hard to go back the other direction.
Yeah, I didn't it just looked like it was a collection of minor leaguers, veteran. I mean, it was ugly. It was unwatchable, and I'd rather just have them. I'd rather watch the juniors play. Let's just put it that way. That's more exciting than.
But again, the one thing you can't say, there were certain guys, as I said, you look at Tolvanen, you look at a couple other guys. Obviously, Kovalchuk is one of the names that everybody knew about because he may come back to the league next year.
Yeah.
So there was some names. To me, though, as I said, I haven't said it before, but we talked a little about. I mean, the hockey to honestly watch was the women's hockey, especially U.S. Canada. I mean, that was some great hockey, especially the game-winning goal.
Yeah.
So it did bolster the women's hockey, but I will agree with you is that the men's hockey left something to be desired, and you can insert whatever adjective you want before that to kind of get your view.
All right, sounds good. So we've got some time, probably another few weeks or so, before we will come back and get everybody ready for the stretch drive. How many more months before the playoffs now?
Probably about 5 weeks or so.
5 weeks, okay. So we'll be back in a few weeks. We'll probably a couple weeks to go before the playoffs begin, and we'll take a look at the playoff race and And then, of course, we are going to be around for the entire Stanley Cup playoffs. That's when things get beefed up here on this show, including a playoff preview show. And then, of course, we'll have previews before every round like we've done the last several years, and potentially other shows as well during rounds, depending on exactly whether or not there are some pretty exciting and long series to talk about. So, Jan, I appreciate your time as always. And next time we talk will probably be football with the Jets in the next couple of weeks before free agency.
Looking forward to it. That if we thought that hockey was interesting, clearly that part of the equation gets even more interesting.
Oh, yeah. It is definitely going to be a lot of fun to be a Jet fan. We said it all during the season that we were looking forward to this month, the 6-week period in between March and the end of April. That was going to be when it was going to be a lot of fun to be a Jet fan. So, Jan, appreciate it. We'll talk to you real soon.
Sounds good.
All right, that's Jan Levine, and that is going to wrap it up here for Prime Sports Hockey on the Prime Sports Radio Network. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at PrimeSN. You can check out our shows available on YouTube and on iTunes on the Prime Sports Network. And we'll have our golf show coming up at 4 o'clock today. We'll have our draft show, NFL draft show tomorrow at 2. College hoops tomorrow at 5. And then we'll also talk... What else are we going to talk? Oh, and then we'll also talk later on in the week horse racing, and probably a few other things I just can't think about right now, including tennis. There you go. So that is going to wrap it up here. Oh, by the way, our baseball show won't be until next week. So I don't even know if I mentioned baseball, but we will have a baseball show next week. We have our baseball show last week to get things started, and we'll continue with our baseball talk next week. So for Jan Levine, I'm Greg DePalma. Thanks for tuning in to Prime Sports Hockey. We'll see you next time. Coming to an end, we have to unify and watch our flag ascend.